Yeah, I know. Good evening, everybody. I'm First Selectman Christine Vitale, and I am calling this special meeting of the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance to order. The purpose of this meeting is an FOI crash course, just to review FOI requirements, and we're joined here tonight by Russell Blair, the Director of Education and Communications from the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission. So thank you very much for joining us and appreciate everybody who is attending in person and via Zoom.
Thank you. So it's great to be here tonight. I say this sometimes jokingly, but it may end up being true. Most important thing you might learn is my phone number and my email. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I know this can be difficult. You know, most of you are probably not attorneys. I should share, I'm actually not an attorney either. My background is in journalism. That's kind of where I came into FOI and public meetings. And, you know, I used to be the lonely reporter in the back, you know, at the Board of Selectmen meetings going until God knows what hour. I learned in one town I covered, they actually in their rules had a cutoff. If they got to midnight, they actually had to end. And that actually happened once when I was at a meeting, which is kind of crazy. But I say all that, you know, to say that this can be hard. Part of my job, you know, doing these trainings and outreach is to try to be a resource to the town. So, you know, certainly you've got great counsel here and you can ask him anything. And if he doesn't know, he'll probably ask me. So, you know, but it's an open line of communication. You know, I really try to help interpret these things, give you guidance, share decisions, you know, even if it's a new thing and you're just like, well, what is the commission thinking? You know, I'm happy to answer those and, you know, check and talk to my boss and see what the thinking is on some of these things because, you know, the law is 50 years old, but there's a lot of evolutions and changes and, you know, remote meetings is not totally new, but, you know, we get a lot of questions around that. So, you know, I can't steal it from the Office of State Ethics, but I'd like to say the same thing they say, which is, you know, call for advice if you need it. So, or if there's ever any need for training in the future, you know, you're part of some organization, professional group or something like that. You know, I've done different stuff for, you know, zoning enforcement officers or for the bar association or whatever. So, you know, I have some stuff we're going to go through today, but again, you know, in the future, if you ever need anything, please feel free to call or email. So as I mentioned, you know, the law goes back to 1975, and I like to talk a little bit about the history of the law when I do any of these presentations. And I should also say, I'll stop along the way and ask for questions. Anyone in the room is probably easier online. I might just do them at the end because I can't kind of see everybody coming in. But, you know, I'll ask if you have a question and you're in the room, you could just pipe up or, you know, put your hand up. You know, the law goes back to 1975. Governor Ella Grasso was the real champion of the Freedom of Information Act. And one thing I learned, you know, recently actually is that she's really the reason we have a Freedom of Information Commission. We do an annual conference every year, and this year we had a panel reflecting on the 50 years. And we were lucky enough to have somebody who actually worked in the governor's office when the law was being drafted and knew firsthand all this stuff. And one of the things he said was that, you know, when they were coming up with this law and there was an appetite for, you know, some sort of open records and open meetings law, especially after Watergate, you know, a lot of people point to that as kind of the inflection point. But he said it was her who sort of said, we got to have enforcement, right? What good is the law if we don't have anybody to actually make sure that, you know, cities and towns and state agencies are doing it? And so that is where the, you know, the Freedom of Information Commission comes into play. So, you know, the law, the name can be a little misleading sometimes, especially, you know, to members of the public because they hear freedom of information and they think it means I can just call you at any hour and ask you anything and you have to give me the answer, right? It's information, it's my information, I want to know what's going on. The law does allow people to figure out what's going on, but it's specific to public meetings and public records. So, you know, we're really going to focus today on meetings. You know, I'm happy to answer any questions on records. If we have some time, we could touch on a few things. But one thing to remember is, you know, FOI is about requests for public records and it's about requirements for public meetings. So it, you know, is not meaning people can call you up at all hours and ask you things. People probably still do that, but they can't file a complaint with us if you don't know the answers to their questions. So we were talking about enforcement, and that's where the commission comes in. So the commission, if you're not familiar with the commission, I say maybe that's a good thing. It might mean that, you know, there hasn't been a complaint or a proceeding or anything like that, but you know, we are a state agency, and the only thing we do is we investigate alleged violations of the Freedom of Information Act. So if anyone out there, you know, a citizen, an attorney, a town employee, you know, whoever it may be, a journalist, they believe something wasn't done properly in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act, they file a complaint with our commission. And, we would review the complaint. We always try to mediate every complaint. The first phase, we have an ombudsman, who's from our office who tries to settle the issues and see if there's a way to resolve it without a hearing. But if necessary, we hold an evidentiary hearing. And, we would take in evidence and hear from witnesses. And, so if it was a meetings issue and you're on a board, you might have to go to a hearing and testify about what happened. There was a complaint about an executive session, maybe the agenda wasn't specific. We might say, well, what was the reason for the executive session? What did you put on the agenda? Those types of things. So, we investigate that. If we find an alleged violation, we can do different things to remedy that. We can order production of records if somebody requested something and they weren't provided with it. And we determine that they are entitled to a copy. We can also order mandatory trainings. We can issue fines. We didn't used to do the fines too much, but we are starting to do it a little bit more. So there have been cases where, particularly repeat offenders, that's one thing I think we understand. The first time something happens, maybe people don't know. Sometimes there's a case and then we order a training or they ask for training. We try to clear things up. But if we're seeing the same things over and over again, that might be where we would consider a fine. Or if we see something that, seems like it's really deceitful or, really, not so much a misunderstanding, but an intentional, tactic or something to not allow someone to get access to information or to try to prevent people from coming to a meeting, that type of thing. We can also nullify votes that were taken at public meetings. If the notice wasn't proper. That doesn't happen all that often, but we did have a case not too far from here in Greenwich recently where we nullified a vote to appoint somebody to the Board of Ed because they convened an emergency meeting. And the story about that, and I've been sharing it with people, so I don't think it really, is speaking out of school. The thing that, to me was a little surprising was they called us and asked for advice, and I said, don't do it. And they did it. And a year later, they got the vote nullified. So, that was one where, literally you can't make it up. They asked me about this, and I remember because I was at a training in Darien, and some other attorney in the office took the call, and then I called the woman back, and so call for advice, but try, listen to what we say sometimes. So, but in all seriousness, this is why it's important. It's important for a whole host of reasons. But one thing, I think is key is that you don't want to have a fine. You don't want to have your votes nullified. The hope is that you understand, through this presentation and through calling me or talking to your attorney, that you know what you need to do. And FOI is not a thing that you're up at night worrying about. It's not a big headache. It's part of the job. You know what you have to do. You get it done. If you have questions, you know that you can ask for advice. That sort of thing. So, okay. What is a public agency? I include this slide in the presentation mostly just because I tend to use this word a lot because that's what the law refers to as basically any office or body or committee that is covered under FOI. So, if you have a town, the first selectman's office is a public agency. Public Works Department is a public agency. All of your boards, your Board of Finance, your Board of Selectmen. Basically, if you're part of government, you're going to be covered under FOI. And one important thing that I even have in bold there is also committees of or created by public agencies are also public agencies in their own right. So things like subcommittees. One important thing is that what you call something doesn't really matter. It's who's on it. So, if the Board of Selectmen appoints people to a subcommittee or a task force or a, blue ribbon panel, if they are doing the work of the Board of Selectmen, they're going to be covered under FOI. One way to think about it is you can't delegate away your authority. So if the Board of Selectmen is covered under FOI and, you create a school building committee and there's members from the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed, that's going to be a public agency under FOI. When we talk about the definition of meetings, in a second, you'll see that, it does not mean that every single gathering of elected officials is automatically going to be a meeting. There's a little bit of nuance there. But I think the important thing is, if you're creating different groups and offshoots of boards and commissions, there's a little bit of wiggle room sometimes, but more often than not, especially if it's something where, it's formally designated, there's a, something that gets voted on, there's a motion, there's appointments, those are probably going to be covered under FOI. In very rare circumstances, the law can be extended to nonprofits or businesses, but only if they're serving a governmental function. Doesn't really come up all that often. The biggest one for municipalities is actually libraries, because some libraries are technically a nonprofit, but then there's a town board that governs them. But even some libraries, we had a case with the Westport Library, and we said that they're not covered under FOI because of the way that they're constructed. So even with libraries, there's differences sometimes from town to town. Okay, so meetings, hopefully this isn't what it's like when you guys are having a meeting. I imagine you guys are probably pretty busy with your new members and everything. And, the looming budget discussions that we all consume so much of our lives. I was trying to reschedule the thing that I mentioned to some people. I had a thing that got snowed out that was supposed to go tomorrow. I don't think we're going to get a lot of snow, but I asked them, could we do it in February? And they said, nope, that's budget starts. We can't do it in February. So, but in any event, so as I was saying, the definition of a meeting, this is really important because, meeting under FOI has a very specific meaning. And I think the simplest way to explain it I have found is that there's sort of three kind of triggers. And if all three things are happening, then I would argue that that's a meeting under FOI's definition, which means that it has to be publicly noticed, has to be open to the public, you have to take minutes, and people can record it and so on. So all the rules of FOI apply. The first thing is a convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency. So that is really important. Quorum is kind of a key element of a meeting under FOI. The commission used to view meetings more broadly, but we had a case where, we had a decision, it got appealed, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, we lost at the Supreme Court, and they focused in on that quorum piece. And they said, that's an essential element. So first element of a meeting under FOI is a quorum. The second is that, we have quorum of board members, and that they are either gathered together, convening or assembly, or it's a communication by or to a quorum in person or by means of electronic equipment. So it's that's important because we're going to talk in a second about things like text messages and emails. So a meeting is not just we gathered at the first selectman's office around the conference table. Under the definition of a meeting in FOI, a meeting could be an email chain, a meeting could be a text message group chat, a meeting could be Facebook Messenger, right? The format doesn't matter. What matters is it's a quorum of board members, they're together or they're communicating. And then the last thing, they're discussing or acting upon, I'm not going to read all the things there, but for shorthand, I would call it board business. So if we have a quorum of board members and they are gathered together and they either virtually or in person, and they're discussing or acting upon board business, that is, I think, what makes a meeting under FOI. So again, the thing you want to be careful about is settings where you have emails with all the board members on them, or text messages with all the board members. Look, if you're just, if it's purely administrative or ministerial things, like you're trying to schedule a special meeting, if you're trying to schedule what we did this evening, you're asking people when they're available. Somebody says, hey, I can't make the meeting, and they want to let the board members know. Even like a one-way communication, if you got a letter from a constituent and you want to share it with the rest of the board, hey, we got this letter, I want you all to see what the letter said. They sent it to me because they know me, but this is an issue I think we should all be aware of. The key thing is the back and forth discussion. So, the classic example would be if the clerk sends out the agenda to everybody, here's the agenda for next week's meeting, we'll see you all there. The members should not be responding in an email thread with everybody there talking about, what they think of the items on the agenda or how they're going to vote on a certain matter or something like that. And the key thing is the quorum part. So I should have looked this up ahead of time, but are you guys a 3-member board, selectmen? So that does make this really difficult. And I'm not gonna, and I'm not gonna lie that there are probably, hundreds of violations of this with the 3-member board. Probably, if we were to survey the entire state, it probably happens, more often than we would like to admit. So a couple things I'll say about that. One is we're going to talk about exceptions later on, and there is an exception for caucuses. So, if the 2 members on the board of the same party, they can communicate, and it could, under the caucus provision, it's not a meeting. I think the thing I would say, because I've gotten into some, extended conversations, a lot of, especially people in smaller towns, where they don't have as many staff people supporting them. And, I think you kind of understand, if you read this and you look at this, it's not, obviously it's not just voting. It's really the substantive discussions. If you pass somebody in the hallway, say something to them, it's probably not going to end up in an FOI complaint in a hearing in Hartford and all that. But if, if a quorum of a board sits down for hours and they're discussing something and then it pops up on an agenda or a selectman meeting and people say, well, where did that come from? Those are the types of things where, those discussions can be, can be problematic. And, to give an example of a real scenario, I was doing this out in a small town in Eastern Connecticut, and I was talking about this. They had a 3-member board of selectmen, and the first selectman, I do this, and he shoots up and he says, well, what if there's a pothole and we all want to go out and look at the pothole? And I said, well, if you want to go out and look at the pothole and you can see how big it is, or what, great. I don't think there's a problem with that. But while you're looking at the pothole, don't talk about how much money you're going to spend to fix it, and where you're going to move the money from, and the appropriations and all this kind of stuff. Just funny the problems we have in different towns. But that was the thing that he asked me about. So I think you can go out with your other selectmen if you all want to go and look at it, so you have an idea when you talk at the meeting. Because that was his thing. Well, if we don't know what it looks like, how are we going to figure out how to fix it? Yes.
You help me finding what makes up a quorum.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said a voting majority of your board, and you don't count the vacancies. So
Majority.
yeah, majority of the board. Whatever, so if it's 5, it's 3. If it's 7, it's 4. Majority. Majority of the board. I think the reasoning there is that it's enough people to pass something, right? So if we have 4 members of our 7-member board and they meet with no public input or anything, they could decide something amongst themselves, and then there could be a meeting, and then the sort of proposal has already been decided before the meeting. I think is the intent there. So again, email, text messages, those kind of things. Just be mindful. The other thing to be mindful of is before and after meetings. Especially if it's something really contentious, and people are looking for something to seize on. Sometimes it could be, hey, we were leaving the meeting, we saw the whole board was, all huddled around in a circle in the parking lot, and they were talking about, something. And honestly, a lot of the time, it's probably not about the board stuff. I mean, I would think you're so occupied with the board stuff that when you have a chance to talk about other stuff, you're talking about the new restaurant that opened up, or, what your kids are going, where they're going to go for college and different things. And so, those conversations are fine. It's about the board business. So, I think, again, it's hard with a 3-member board of selectmen, but, less, because I usually tell people, well, less than a quorum, which, for you guys, it really doesn't work like that. But, with larger boards, you can have 2 or 3 members of a big board, of a 9-member board can talk, or, this applies even in your circumstances. People can talk to staff, that doesn't, so if there's a question and, the members of the board of selectmen, one of them wants to call the public works director, it's not about limiting the communication or the flow of information. It's more about, when it comes time to decide and make decisions, that we're doing it in public. Anyone have any other questions on that?
How about if this entire room was a commission? I could meet with you and I'm talking, that's not a meeting. How about if I was emailed you?
Like individually? So we've had some, we've had some cases where if you do that and somebody were to file a complaint and we were, able to get, like, let's say we got those emails, that could be called what we would call a serial meeting. So if you're doing it for the purposes of avoid, if you're going to say, well, I'm just going to email everyone individually and ask how they're going to vote, if it's all the same thing that is being communicated to the same people over and over again, I think would probably say it's a meeting, because it's a serial. It ends up being a communication prior to a quorum because you're asking everybody the same thing. So again, sharing information is okay. It's the back and forth responses and the dialogue is where there can be issues. So a couple other ground rules for meetings. Anyone can attend a public meeting. They're not required to give their name or sign in. In person, that doesn't usually pose a problem. I've gotten some questions about Zoom more and more recently. People have said, well, if someone's on Zoom and it just says the phone number and we don't know who they are and we ask them, they won't tell us, they have a right to be there. So, I would be cautious about kicking people out of Zoom meetings, just because they won't turn their camera on or say who they are. Obviously, if someone's being disruptive or something, Zoom bombing, we've seen that, that is cause to remove somebody from a meeting if you had to do that. Public comment is not required under the FOI Act, so it's up to the local boards and commissions how to do that. You know, if some towns have governing documents that require public comment or something like that, but it's a totally local thing. So, you know, you could have it at one meeting, you could not have it at the next meeting. And that is where, you know, you can ask people to give their name and address if they want to comment at the meeting, that's okay. It's just about attendance, you know, so if somebody wants to comment, you could ask for that. Yes.
Do you have a notice public comment?
Like as an agenda item?
Yeah.
I think I would put it on the agenda if you're going to have it, you know, because what I would say, and we can talk more about, you know, like agendas in a second, but what our courts have said is agendas need to fairly apprise the people of the business to be conducted at a meeting so they can adequately prepare and decide whether to attend the meeting or not. So I think for a lot of people, public comment is a decision factor, right? So if you, you know, I mean, if you don't have it on the agenda and then you do it, somebody could file a complaint and say, well, you know, I didn't know there was public comment on the agenda, and they did it anyway. You know, but the other thing I'll say too is, like, you know, again, because it's not required and it's within your limitations, you know, you can set time limits. You could say we're done for public comment tonight. We got other stuff we got to do. You know, so it's wholly a local decision how you want to do that. And, you know, again, the names and addresses is quite common. You know, a couple of minutes is quite common. Asking people to address items on the agenda is quite common. So, you know, you can do all those types of things, and that's fine. And then anyone can photograph, record, or broadcast a public meeting. So I just tell people, and it seems kind of common sense, but, you know, don't say anything at the meeting that you wouldn't want somebody to record, or you wouldn't want to end up in the newspaper, because, you know, they can record it, they can video it, they can photograph it. They don't need to get permission or anything like that. You know, as long as they're not being disruptive, they're allowed to do that. Okay. So email and meetings, we already kind of talked about this, you know, in the corporate world, people, you know, say, oh my God, you know, this meeting could have been an email. Why are we all here? In FOI world, it's, you know, oh my God, this email should have been a meeting, and why are they doing this? So, you know, again, just be careful about those kind of things. You know, the back and forth debate, save that for, you know, for the public meeting. And, you know, the other thing I'll say, you know, I don't know how often people do this, but I always tell people, look, if you see this in the thread, you know, you could step up and say, hey, let's hold off on this, right? You know, that's a good way to avoid a complaint. And, you know, is to say, hey, let's make sure we're not, you know, getting into these discussions. You know, because again, especially if something is controversial or contentious or a big issue, you know, it's important to be having your discussions, you know, in public. You know, we'll talk about executive session in this later on in the presentation. You know, and sometimes I get calls from people about executive session, and they say, well, you know, we want to do it in executive session because we need to get all our ducks in a row, or this is going to be a difficult conversation. You know, I would say part of being in public office is you have to have difficult conversations, and you do it in public, right? You know, it's not about hiding things. It's about confronting the issues and trying to find ways to solve them. So, okay. So before we move on, any other questions so far? I think we're good, right? Okay. So this is where I'll talk about the different types of meetings. And, you know, the two main kinds of meetings are regular meetings and special meetings. There is a third kind, emergency meetings, which I'll touch on in a second. You know, my general advice with emergency meetings is really just don't do it. It very rarely would it ever be something you would need to do, but we can talk about that in a second. But so your main two kinds of meetings are regular meetings and special meetings. So every board, maybe you've already done it or you're in the process, every year you should publish an annual meeting schedule. And all of the agendas and schedules and minutes and all this stuff, it all goes through the town clerk's office. That is kind of the clearinghouse for everything FOI related. So your annual meeting schedule, you file that with the town clerk's office. Those are your regular meetings for the year. If you want to meet at any time or date, you know, that wasn't on there, then that requires calling a special meeting. And even if you keep the day but change the time, it makes it a special meeting. So, you know, if there was inclement weather and you wanted to move the meeting up, you know, a couple hours, that still is a special meeting. So the difference with special meeting is really in the timing. The name is a little bit misleading because you can do anything, you know, business-wise. You can do any business that you would have done at a regular meeting at a special meeting. It's not, you know, sometimes people call them because there's some issue that came up, but you know, it could be as simple as, you know, people are on vacation that week in the summer and you want to move it a different week. So for regular meetings, The agenda needs to be filed in the town clerk's office 24 hours before the meeting. Keep in mind things like, if your town hall closes early or there's holidays, if you're a board that meets on Tuesdays, you have to keep in mind all those Monday holidays, because you can't file the agenda if the town hall is closed. I've had some people ask me, well, what if we post it online? It's kind of interesting because for municipalities, legally, and I wouldn't advise you that you do this, but legally, regular meeting agendas do not have to be posted online, but they have to be filed in the town clerk's office. So even if you post it online, some people might argue, well, that's better public notice, but if you posted the agenda online, but you failed to file it with the town clerk, that would be an FOI violation. So you have to do it in the clerk's office. I would try to do, for regular meetings, do both. Special meetings in the clerk's office, and they absolutely have to be posted online. So if you're doing a special meeting, you need to make sure that the agenda is posted on your website. So the other sort of differences between regular and special meetings, there's a couple of kind of technical differences. One is pretty important, and that is that at a regular meeting, you can add any items to the agenda during the meeting by a 2/3 vote. So a lot of times we'll see an item like new business on an agenda. If you want to add anything under new business, you should say what it is, take a vote, add the item, and then, proceed with it. And I would argue, if you have old business, the same thing, if it's not a specific item on there, because again, the agenda needs to fairly apprise the public of what will be discussed. So, you can list old business and list items, but if there isn't any old business and you're asking people, do you have anything you want to return to, I think you could ask to take a vote, put it on there. Again, at a regular meeting, a special meeting cannot add items to the agenda. So special meeting agendas, if you're sending them around for review, to people, make sure everything is on there that you would need to do, because if you get to the meeting and you realize we forgot something, if it's a special meeting, you'd be out of luck. And keep that in mind too, if like the meeting gets moved, and make sure everyone knows what kind of meeting it is. Cause I've even seen that sometimes where people, like, they just didn't realize because it got snowed out and it got moved and they forgot. So the other thing, believe it or not, we get complaints about everything. We had one where the town didn't do the 2/3 calculation right. So, you don't normally have to be like a math major to figure that out, but I think it was like 7 members, and I don't remember if it's maybe 2/3 of 7 ends up being like 5 point something and you need 6 or something, but just make sure you have the votes to do that. And then minutes, we'll talk more about, the content and what goes into minutes in a second, but there's a slight difference in when they need to be filed. 7 calendar days for regular meeting minutes and 7 business days for special meeting minutes. Again, I have a slide where we'll go through all the stuff on minutes. So if you have questions on minutes, we can take those after we go through that. But does anyone have any questions on this? Yes.
Why is it calendar days for regular meetings and business days?
I wish I knew the answer to that, because it drives me crazy. I don't know why they made that distinction. The only guess I can have is that maybe because a special meeting is more unexpected, it gives you more time to do the minutes. If you have to call a special meeting for some reason and it's not, recording secretary is not available, you have a few extra days, but I really don't know why, other than that's my best guess. So.
My other question is, I'm on the Board of Finance, and oftentimes we're not getting minutes to vote on at our meeting until the earliest would be the next meeting, which
yes. So
and sometimes it's 4 months later.
Yeah. So this is I'll talk about it now because you brought it up. I always get kind of questions about this. So there's no like right way under FOI to approve the minutes, other than like you shouldn't do it over email, because you can't vote on things over email, and that be a meeting and that whole issue. So my guidance would be, you have to file the minutes within 7 days. Whatever you have available within 7 days, those are your minutes. Now, they haven't been approved, they haven't been voted on by the board. So different towns do it differently. I've told some people, if you want to put on there, these are subject to approval, you could do that. If you want to say they're draft or whatever you want to call them, that's fine, but you have to have something available and produced. Like one town I was doing a training in recently, they told me, and I was like, oh yeah, this is fine. Their practice was that when they get those initial minutes in, they have them on file, but they don't put them in the book in the town clerk's office, in the official book, until they're approved. So they're there if people want them, but they don't go in the book until they're approved, because, if there's revisions or whatever. So that was their way of doing it. Like what I would say, I think the simplest way to do it is just, take in what you have. Those are your minutes. If you're going to change them, it might be harder if it's 4 months later, but if it's like the next meeting, you could make changes and then put those in the minutes of that of that meeting. Like I do our minutes for the FOI commission. If we have to amend them, we just had our November meeting, I might, in my November minutes say, the October 22nd minutes were approved with the following changes. So, but the key thing is that they're filed within the 7 calendar days or the 7 business days.
Two questions. One with the minutes. So by being filed and posted, or just filed with the town clerk?
So filed with the town clerk.
So they don't necessarily.
They don't necessarily have to be posted online. So the other thing some towns will do is they might say, well, we'll file them in the town clerk's office. We'll wait to post them online until they get approved. Now, you could do that. The problem I see with that sometimes is that, in 2025, most people are looking to websites for minutes. And there are people who call me and they look on their town's website, they don't see the minutes, and they're asking me how to file a complaint. And I tell them, well, did you ask the town clerk's office? Because, you guys have I forgot to mention this, but very important distinction is that municipal agencies don't have to post their minutes online. There's like a gap in the law. It used to be that it was required. And then in the early 2000s, my predecessor told me, I guess what happened with some of the smaller towns that didn't have full-time web people, this was the early-ish days of the internet, they pushed back on it. So the legislature took it out. They never put it back in. And a lot of towns just have done it all along. I mean, I think putting the minutes online makes a lot of sense. And that's why I say, like, if you want to say draft or not approved, so somebody realizes that these could change, because more often than not, I think people are going to look on the website and they may not even think to go to the town clerk's office. So, that again, it's your preference how you do it. But I think getting them on the website as soon as you can, I think is not a bad idea.
Then I had one other, supplemental agendas. Are they like allowed within 24 hours?
Yeah, so like if you posted a first agenda and then 2 days before the meeting, you wanted to revise it, yeah, you could.
What happens if you posted an agenda and 10 hours before the meeting?
No, yeah, you could not. Yeah, you can't modify it less than 24 hours before. If it's a regular meeting, you can add an item, to the agenda. So, yeah, with a 2/3 vote, especially you can't. And it's kind of funny because sometimes there's these things where arguably the thing that is greater benefit to the public creates an FOI violation. And this is kind of one of those things where, some people, I think you could argue, well, wouldn't it be better if we put a new agenda out 10 hours before the meeting versus just adding it at the meeting where nobody has any idea? But the problem is if you do that and you filed it and then somebody picks up that agenda and they go, it was stamped in the morning of the meeting, they could say, well, now it's not timely. So if things come up before 24 hours, then by all means, you could publish a revised agenda. If it comes up the day of the meeting, you'd have to add it to the agenda.
So a special meeting, you have to hard cut off.
Yeah, a special meeting is a hard cutoff, yeah. Okay. So emergency meetings, again, my advice with this is really just don't do it. It ends badly in most cases. So unfortunately now we have 2 examples from Fairfield County. We've got Ridgefield, which used to be still probably is the preeminent one because it went all the way to the Supreme Court, but we also have the Greenwich one now. Emergency meeting, the idea there is we can't wait 24 hours to call a special meeting. It's something so extraordinary. We got to make a decision right now because there's going to be some major repercussions. I would argue it's really kind of like weather, property damage, like things of life and limb kind of stuff. It's not, we forgot to do something, a deadline. I've had some of the smaller towns that have town meetings. One first selectman called me once and, we forgot to we got to vote tonight because we have to get the notice in the newspaper and the town meeting thing and it has to be there within so many days. And, it was like, well, you missed your chance, you were too late. The Greenwich one was, that they didn't make an appointment to the Board of Education and they waited too long. And there's an interesting thing, maybe some of you guys could file it away. There's a statute that if a vacancy on a Board of Ed is not filled within a certain period of time, the Board of Selectmen can appoint somebody. And that's what happened there. And so they called an emergency meeting to get in front of the Board of Selectmen making the appointment. So the emergency was they waited too long to make the appointment. The emergency in the Ridgefield case was, this was a personnel matter that happened on a Friday and they called an emergency meeting on a Saturday morning to basically the fire person ended up resigning, but, they could have waited until Monday or Tuesday. They could have put the guy on paid suspension and dealt with it next week. So, if you do ever have an emergency meeting, the reason it's held to such a high standard is because there is no notice or agenda requirement. So it's basically the law letting you have a secret meeting. somebody asked me once, well, is it a public meeting? I think it is. So if somebody happened upon it, I think you'd have to let them in. But, you know, the bar is pretty high, and you can only consider emergency matters. And you have to file the minutes within 72 hours of the meeting. And those minutes have to be posted online. So emergency meeting minutes need to go online. But again, I would really just strongly, unless it's something, you know, really severe, just don't do this if you can avoid it. You know, again, 24-hour notice for a special meeting. There's provisions about meeting remotely now. So, you know, something happens, you know, you could convene a meeting the next day remotely with the whole board of selectmen if you needed to, right? So there's a lot of flexibility, I think, that doesn't make this needed. Okay, so this is what I like to call when is a meeting not a meeting. So we mentioned this already with caucuses a little bit, but I'll just talk about this. So, you know, people might be familiar with the FOI Act in terms of records requests, and there's certain information that's exempt. These are sort of certain times where the law gives you special permission, even though it's a quorum of a board, even though they're together, and even though they're discussing board business, it is not a publicly noticed meeting under FOI. It's not open to the public. You don't have to take minutes and so on. I'll talk about caucuses because that tends to be the one that has the most interest and happens the most frequently. So a caucus under FOI is like a little bit different than what we think of as a caucus. You know, if you're in a political party, you think of like nominating caucuses and that kind of stuff. The only thing in FOI caucus is it's really defined by who is in it. So under FOI, a caucus is a convening of you know, the members of a board or commission, all of whom are on the same political party. So, you know, the Republicans on the board of selectmen, the Democrats on the board of finance. And it's basically saying even if one party controls the board, they can still all meet as members of that party and they can talk about whatever they want. The caucus definition in FOI doesn't talk about what you can talk about. It basically says who is a caucus. You don't have to notice the caucuses. You don't have to file. You know, the only filing requirement is if you have a caucus where everybody is not of the same party. Like if you had a petitioning candidate who wanted to caucus with one side or the other, you had a third party candidate. It doesn't come up all that often. But one important thing with caucuses is that, you know, it is not members of other boards of the same party. I've seen that sometime, you know, so you can't have, you know, the majority of the board of finance sit down with the majority of the board of selectmen, you know, just to say, oh, we're all Democrats, so we can do, you know, it doesn't work like that. The caucus is your board. You know, the town chairman can't sit in on a FOI caucus, you know, because they're not, unless they're a member of the same board. So basically it's permission for the majority of a board to meet, you know, outside of public meetings to talk about things. And again, the law doesn't define what you could talk about. So it can be a pretty big loophole. You know, this is where I talk about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. You know, I would hope that, you know, people don't abuse it and make the decisions in caucus, but it does happen, you know, from time to time. You know, I mentioned how I used to be, I think I mentioned I used to be a journalist or reporter. One time that I worked at the Hartford Courant, the reporter who covered the Hartford City Council meeting was out sick. You know, she asked me to fill in for her. So I went to the meeting and I said, oh, this will be great. There'll be all kinds of stuff happening. It was like a half-hour meeting. They didn't discuss any of the motions. They just went through boom, 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 voted on everything. And so I called her the next day and I was like, what happened? And then she told me, oh, they do everything in caucus beforehand. The Democrats gather an hour before the meeting. They go through everything in caucus. They decide how everything's going to go. And she was like, the public meeting is basically for show, which was legal, right? But it was kind of like disheartening because I was like, well, this is how they do it, you know, and, you know, but so that's where I would say, like, could do that. I would hope that you would understand like the importance of discussion and dialogue and that you wouldn't, you know, you would choose to have the discussions in public.
So we have some independents on our commission. So where do they fit in?
So if they, what I would say is that it's like unaffiliated candidates. Did they run with either like the endorsement of one of the two parties?
Well,
Or were they like purely?
environmental conservation, we're appointed.
Okay. Yeah, so if you're unaffiliated, then that's where I talked about the registration thing. You can decide, if you're unaffiliated, you can decide for the purposes of FOI who you want to caucus with. So like sometimes what'll happen is, you know, somebody isn't on, because the caucus thing is all about party registration. So you could be an unaffiliated voter and run on the Republican ticket and get elected. You're not a Republican, but you're serving as a, you know, on that seat. So if you're unaffiliated or you're minor party, you can register with the town clerk what the caucus is for that board.
I think the point is you have to register though with the.
Yeah,
town
only if it's
clerk.
unaffiliated or minor party. If
Yeah.
it's just Republicans and Democrats, you don't need to register anything. If the board is only Republicans and Democrats, you have a Republican caucus, you have a Democratic caucus.
Does the whole caucus have to register or just the unaffiliated or independent person that ran with it? Because like, for instance, like I know there's there were a few unaffiliated independents on the RTM, it's a big body. And they don't caucus, I don't think, with the Democrats because they can't, but they ran on the Democratic ticket.
Yeah, so I think if they wanted to caucus with the Democrats, they could just file something with the.
But I know last year when we had someone leave the Democratic caucus for unaffiliated, they said that the whole caucus, every single person on it would have to register in order for them to caucus individually.
Yeah, if you want to send me an email, I can check on that, because it depends on the language of the statute. I've seen it both ways. More often, I've seen like all the people, but I don't know if that's required. I'm not, because I could see the thing where it's like, well, if somebody, if you don't want the person in your caucus and they say, I want to be in there, do you have to let them in, kind of thing? So.
Do you have to let every person in that's a member of that party? So in order for it to be considered a caucus, does everyone have to be?
So
invited?
the FOI, definition, like, doesn't get into all that kind of nuance. I mean, obviously, like, you can't exclude a member from like a meeting, because you have to notify them and they, all that kind of stuff. But I've had people ask me about that. I was left out of a caucus, I don't think there's any FOI complaint territory there. Because again, it's not like a noticed meeting where they have to send by the members, or that sort of thing. So. But yeah, if you send me an email, I can check, because I think it would depend on the language of the statute. The biggest thing with, we get with caucuses is usually more about, again, the law is really, is like who is in it, and then kind of how it happens is not addressed, so.
I'm a little confused because it seems like, for example, there's 4 Democrats on the commission. Basically saying, I think that we can just get together and talk about whatever.
Yeah.
In business.
Yeah, it's a very, so my understanding of the exemption is that this was put in there to get the bill passed because the legislature was concerned about their caucuses. At the local level, it kind of gets a little silly sometimes, I think, with some of these things. I think but the way that it's written is, it applies from state on down. So, yeah, you could do that. And that's like what I was talking about with the Hartford City Council. That is what they were doing, at least at the time. I don't know if they're still doing it.
Yeah.
So it was frustrating, I
So
think.
the prohibition really is.
It's who's in it. It's not what you do. If the
If
people.
a bunch of us get together and there's some Democrats and some Republicans, that's a no-no.
Yeah.
But if we're all from one
One party,
party,
yeah.
you can just call it a caucus.
Caucus, and then it's.
Talk about whatever.
We talk about whatever, yes. So like if you, if you wanted to sort of game it out, and like this would be very frustrating, but if you have a 3-member board of selectmen, the 2 selectmen could say, well, we're gonna do everything and decide everything. We're not gonna tell you anything, and you're gonna be totally left out of the process, and at least under FOI, they could do that as a caucus, right? They could sit down before the meeting and go through the agenda and decide everything, what they're gonna do on everything. And again, so I would, basically, you could do that. I would hope in the spirit of FOI, people would decide that they're not gonna do that. But okay, so the other sort of exceptions, personnel search committees, this happens like, if there's looking for a superintendent, a board of education, or a town is looking for a town manager, you can create a search committee, and you could have an entire board be the search committee. So sometimes boards of ed will do that. They'll have the whole board of ed will be the search committee. And the thing is, because it doesn't qualify as a public meeting, it gives them more flexibility. They can, they don't have to notice the meetings, they don't have to take minutes and so on. They can't hire, anybody under FOI, so there still needs to be a public meeting and a vote and all that, but they could find a candidate for a position. Collective bargaining matters can, whether there's a quorum of a board there or not, those can be conducted outside of public meetings. A meeting of public agency staff is not a public meeting, so like a town hall staff meeting with department heads, that kind of thing. And a chancellor social meeting, this is sort of a situation where, a quorum of a board is gathered, but it's not in, it wasn't planned, it's not intended for the discussion of board business. These could be things like holiday parties and gatherings, you're at the same community event together. you know, you're on the Board of Ed and you're both at the, you know, high school, you know, football game or something like that. So, you know, it's allowed. The key thing is, you know, don't conduct your business in those settings. You know, when I do boards of ed, I tell them, you know, don't be sitting in the bleachers at the football game and be talking about the changes to the budget. You know, unless you're going to notice it as a public meeting. So does anyone have any other questions on any of these? So minutes. The biggest thing with minutes that I see where there's an issue is that people want them to be so perfect and complete and have every single thing that everybody said that they don't get them filed on time. That's the most important thing under FOI, is that they're filed on time. We really don't adjudicate disputes about the accuracy of minutes other than, you know, like the votes, for example. So the minutes have to have the votes need to be accurate. They also need to say how each member voted. That's something I don't always see in minutes. So, you know, if it's a split vote, make sure that the minutes reflect not just the numerical, but how each member voted. Who attended the meeting of the board members. You know, sometimes people list other people that were there. You can do that if you want, but board member attendance has to be there. If you have an executive session, you list who attended the executive session besides the board members. So that the town attorney went in, or that the, you know, the public works director went in, or whatever, whoever it was. So again, the sort of battle I see is between the completeness and the filing on time. But from FOI's perspective, that the completeness one is flexible, the timeliness one is not. So find a happy medium where you can get minutes that are, you know, sufficient for your members and for the community, and that they're getting done on time. Like one example I'll give is that, you know, if you have public comment, you don't have to list every single person and everything they said. You know, you could list who the people were and the topic they spoke about, or you could, if it was like a planning and zoning thing, you could say these 15 people spoke in favor, these 7 people spoke against, or you could just not list public comment in the minutes if you didn't want to. You know, nobody has a right to appear in the minutes. Sometimes people might come to your meetings and give you materials or letters and say, attach this to the minutes, or I want this in the minutes, read this into the minutes. You don't have to do any of that. The minutes are within your purview. Make sure you have those things that you need. We already talked kind of about this, the available within 7 days, and the draft minutes are okay. And even if it's a virtual meeting that's recorded, you still have to produce minutes. Now, if there's a full video recording, then the minutes might be briefer, right? Because you could always, you know, one town I was talking to, you know, it was on the public comment issue, and they were like, oh, I think it was the recording secretary called me, and she was like exasperated because how many people were at public comment. And I said, well, why don't you put them, she told me it was recorded. I said, why don't you put the link in the minutes to the video, right? You know, on YouTube, say, here's the public comment, watch it on the YouTube. So you could do something like that if you want. So the key thing with minutes, again, get them in on time, make sure the votes are in there, the people who attended executive session and so on. Any questions on minutes? And these go to the town clerk's office, as we talked about. They don't have to be posted on the website. I would really encourage you to post them on the website, because that's where people are going to be looking for them. Okay. Electronic and remote meetings. Do you guys do hybrid and Zoom free meetings? Okay. So I'll talk about a couple things that I think are important. Happy to take any questions, but I'll also say, if you're looking for more detail than is here, on our website, we have what's called our remote meetings primer. And it kind of goes into all these different scenarios and what to do and that sort of thing, including like if the technology fails, there's a process that you have to go through to try to resume the meeting. You know, if you, you know, one thing I think is important is, you know, if you lose a member and you still have a quorum, you can keep going. You know, it's more about if you lose the quorum because the quorum making person is remote and they drop off, you know, there's things about how you try to reconnect them and so on. One thing I think is really important, I'm jumping around a little bit, but on the end there, I'm getting more and more questions about this. So regardless of the meeting format, board members always have the right to participate remotely. That is in the statute. So, you know, it sounds like you guys are already kind of doing the hybrid and the remote options, but even if there was a meeting where you said this is so important, everyone has got to be there in person. If a board member, you know, couldn't make it or was ill or something like that, you can't deny the board members remote access. It is up to you whether there's remote access to the public. Basically, every meeting, that's your decision. If we want to make it a in-person, do we want to make it a hybrid meeting, or do we want to do a totally remote meeting? And the differences are basically that there's different sort of notice requirements. There's extra notice and a couple extra things you have to do. if you're going to have a remote meeting. So the first is if one of your regular meetings, so again, these are your regular meetings on the calendar, if it's a regular Board of Selectmen or Board of Finance meeting and you want to have remote access, the agenda is still 24 hours, but when you post the agenda, post the link, how people can access it. But at least 48 hours before the meeting, the instructions on how people can attend virtually need to be on the website. So I would interpret that to be the Zoom link, the Teams link, however, WebEx, whatever people are going to use to get there. So a couple ways you could do this. One, if you have the agenda ready to go, you could just post that 48 hours in advance. I think that would cover you. If you're still working on the agenda, if you have a meetings calendar or something like that, you can put the Zoom link there. Some towns I've seen will generate the Zoom links ahead of time for the month or for the week, and they'll post them all at the start of the month or start of the week. Here's all the Zoom meetings. Just make sure the link is there at least 48 hours ahead of time. The reason for that is that, and this doesn't come up a lot, at least I don't get a lot of calls about it. There's provisions in the law about if somebody doesn't have technology, they can ask the town to make accommodations, and they have to do that no sooner than, or no later than 24 hours before. So the idea is 48 hours. They know it's electronic. It gives them time to, do that, or also just to prepare and, update their computer or whatever they have to do. It's only for regular meetings. So special meetings, you can just 24 hours Zoom link on the agenda and you're good to go. So again, when we talked about emergency meetings, there's a lot of flexibility because you could just say online only special meeting. Here's the Zoom link, boom, post it, and you're good to go. People ask about recording meetings. The only meetings you have to record under FOI is that you have to record meetings if it's an online only meeting. So if it's an in-person meeting, if it's a hybrid meeting, those meetings you do not have to record. Now, you might decide to do that. I think a lot of towns, especially during COVID, people got used to watching them online or looking at the videos. So if you have the capability to do it, I think it's a good idea. Also helps like for doing minutes or trying to, pick up on things that, you can only learn so much from reading the minutes. The video can be very helpful if you're trying to look back on what occurred, especially if there was like a presentation or something like that. So, again, if it's an online only meeting, online only regular meeting, even more specific, has to be recorded, posted on the website within 7 days, remain on the website for at least 45 days. You still have to do minutes, even if it's a virtual meeting that's been recorded. Obviously, again, as I said, if there's a recording, the minutes might be shorter. You have the right to run an orderly meeting, whether in person or electronic. So if people are misbehaving or Zoom bombing or whatever, you can kick them out, you can mute them. You don't have to have the chat function open. So if that's a concern, you could just, not have a chat during the meeting. That's not required. The one thing I've gotten some people pushing back on a little bit is, I've had some towns where they say, well, we don't want to put the link on the agenda because we're worried about, if it's on the internet and people abusing it and that sort of thing. There was one town where you had to email the town manager to get the meeting link, and, the statute is clear. It has to be on there. So, I think there's other ways through Zoom you can probably try to limit, interference and those sort of things. But the link should be available. Any questions on electronic meetings? Yeah, I think the most important thing is it's up to you, if you want to do them. Okay, executive session. This is probably the hardest part of FOI for meetings. Somebody had called me today and was asking about this issue. And, I said, I think this is probably where we get the most complaints for meetings. A couple of reasons. One, it's the most open to interpretation because, it's a little bit of a judgment call. I'll try to give you my thinking on some of these things, but it's less black and white than 7 days for the minutes or, 24 hours for the agenda and so on. And the other thing is, this is your closing off part of the meeting to the public. So people are naturally going to be kind of suspicious about, well, what was the big reason? What was so important? People tend to be always curious and they want to know what people were talking about. So what can you go into an executive session for? I'll talk about the different reasons. Then I'll talk about some of the kind of mechanical things of how it works, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. So the first reason to have an executive session is if there is a personnel matter that you want to discuss, and that's defined in the law as things like discussion of the appointment, the performance, the employment, a health matter, the dismissal of a public employee or a public officer. So this can also be related to a board member. So like things like filling a vacancy on a board, you can interview people in executive session if you wanted to, because you're considering their appointment to a board. Or if there was concern about the conduct of a board member, you could discuss that with that board member in executive session. One thing I just recently, it was probably the middle of last year, there was a story in a town where there was this woman who was on the board of ed in that town, and she got arrested because basically she wasn't paying the water bills for her tenants in this apartment building she owned. They had no water and all these issues, and she got charged. And they had an executive session where they asked her to resign. And I thought it was kind of funny because after the meeting, she came out to the press and said, they told me in the executive session they wanted me to resign. And she just sort of said exactly what happened. So, the key thing with personnel matters, though, is that you have to notify the individual who's the subject of the executive session. And the reason for that is that the law gives them the right to request instead that it be heard in open session. So sometimes people ask, like, well, why would that ever happen? Sometimes if there's a disciplinary matter, maybe, and somebody, thinks I didn't do anything wrong, or I want everyone to hear what this is because I think it's so, you've concocted this thing that is so crazy. They could say, all right, you've told me about this. I don't want it in executive session. I want you to have to discuss it in open session. Now, that doesn't give them the right to participate in the discussion. It just says the board has to discuss it in an open session. So the thing where a lot of employees think wrongly is they think, well, if there's an executive session, they have to invite me. They don't have to. So, they have to tell you, and then the member or the public or the employee has the right to decide if they want to have it in open session. But if they waive that right, then the board can conduct an executive session about you without inviting you in, or they can invite you in for a portion and then they can ask you to leave. So it's an important distinction. Other reasons for executive session: pending claims or litigation. The key word there is pending. It's not hypothetical claims or litigation. It's got to be that there's been a lawsuit that's been filed. You've received a notice of intent to sue. There's a demand letter. There's an FOI complaint. There's a CHRO complaint. That there's some legal action has happened or is imminent based on a communication, or it could be the board deciding to take legal action. Maybe you got some unfavorable decision from a state agency and you're thinking about appealing it. Deep did something and you're considering whether you're going to go to court to challenge it or something, some order they issued. So it could also be the board's consideration of that. You can discuss a security matter in executive session if there's concern that a publicity would reveal some kind of security concern or secret or undermine a security issue. This might come up. I know we have people from the Board of Finance here. If you're talking about improvements to a school, security upgrades, and you're really getting into the specifics, we see that. Unfortunately, after Sandy Hook, we saw that more and more. And I know, there was, I think, even state grant money that went around to try to, help with some of these things. So, you can't vote on executive session. So if they're going to make an appropriation or spend the money or whatever, they're going to have to take a public vote. But the executive session would allow people to ask questions about, the specific things that, we might not want to talk about in an open meeting where anybody could be listening in. Sale or lease of property. This allows a municipality, before an offer's been put in or before they enter into a lease agreement, they can discuss it in executive session if there's concern that a public discussion is going to somehow drive up the cost to the town. There's a vacant property and the town is considering buying it for recreation fields. If the community knows that that's happening, a developer might come in and put a bid up, just to bid the price up, because they know the town wants it. Once the offer's been made and everything's kind of going through, at that point, you would have to be conducting it in public. But this allows for some of those preliminary discussions. And then the last one is the trickiest, and that is any records that are exempt from FOI. If you're going to have a discussion that's going to reveal the contents of those records or reviewing those records, then you can have that in executive session. So again, we're not going to have time to go through all the record stuff today, but the biggest one probably is attorney-client privilege. So there's an exemption in FOI for attorney-client privilege. So if you get a communication from the attorney, that's a privileged document. You wouldn't have to give it out under an FOI request. So if you have legal questions, I think the best way to do it, if there's not a pending claim or litigation, you can't go in under pending claims or litigation, but you can ask your attorney to give you a memo, an opinion, a letter, or something like that. Then you can go into executive session, for the purposes of discussing, you know, an attorney-client memo or a legal opinion or something like that. So you need to have a 2/3 vote to go into executive session. So again, make sure that you do that. If you don't have the 2/3 vote, then you can't go into executive session on that item. You can't vote during executive session. We already talked about that. Who can go into the executive session? It's up to the board. You know, the key thing is anybody you're bringing in, they should be there for the purposes of giving their opinion or testimony. You know, we had a case recently with a school board, and we said that even a school superintendent, if they're not participating, they should not be in the executive session. That was kind of a one-off. It was a little odd. You know, basically what happened is there was some insurance issue, and there was an attorney from the insurance company, and there was a superintendent, and the superintendent didn't say a word the entire time. The attorney for the insurance company did the whole presentation and everything in executive session. I was talking about this at a training for the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education, and somebody said, well, how do we know what happened in the executive session? It was actually a member of the board that filed the complaint. So, you know, sometimes people say, well, with executive session, you know, who's going to know? Well, you never know. I mean, you could even have a board member of your own, you know, if they're, you know, concerned about it, or they think it's wrong, you know, they could file a complaint potentially. The last thing with executive session I think is really, really important is agendas for the meetings. So even if the only thing you're going to do is have, you know, convene an executive session, it is still a public meeting. So you still have to do an agenda. You still have to take minutes. You know, it is open to the public for the portions that aren't in executive session. So you gavel in, and then the public could leave. And, you know, when you're done, you'd have to open the doors back in if anyone is still there, if they want to come back in. But again, the agendas need to fairly apprise the public of what will be discussed. And so it seems a little counterintuitive because, you know, we think of executive session as it's privileged and secretive, and what we say here doesn't leave the room and all that. But what I would say is the way to think about it, I think, is the conversations are confidential. The topic that you're discussing, you know, generally needs to be known to the public. So to give an example, I don't know that you would necessarily, if there's a disciplinary matter, and that's, you know, you're going to go into a personnel matter executive session, because people are always asking me, like, where's the line? How far do we have to go? I don't think the commission would say you have to name the individual employee, but, you know, if you just say, you know, executive session personnel matters, I mean, that could be anything. That could be filling a vacancy on a board. That could be hiring somebody, firing somebody. That could be a health matter. So, you know, if our scenario is that, let's say that there's a disciplinary matter in the Public Works Department, you could put on the agenda, you know, discussion of disciplinary matters in the Public Works Department, discussion of the performance of employees in the Public Works Department. You know, not like you're listing the individual names of the people, or, you know, in some cases, if it's something really big, like the superintendent, you know, discussion of the performance of the superintendent, you might just put it on there. But, you know, I think finding that, you know, I think the best way to think of it is the topic should be known. What we are saying about it is what is privileged. So like with pending litigation, you know, if you're talking about a specific court case, you know, court cases are public record once they're filed. You could just put the docket number or the name of the case or the topic of the litigation. You know, I mentioned earlier about the fines. We actually had a first selectman who got fined because 3 times in a row, his board just put executive session pending litigation. And the thing that was, you know, kind of frustrating, I mentioned earlier about the Greenwich thing and how they called me beforehand. In the middle of that, I did a training for the town, and when we talked about that, and somebody asked a question about it, and it was kind of funny because I think the 3rd complaint, they put that in their complaint. They said, and Mr. Blair came and did a training, and there was slides, what it said. And so, you know, you know, they either weren't paying attention or they disagreed. I don't know, but I know it seems a little counterintuitive, but, you know, again, make sure there's sufficient description of the item. You know, again, the conversations are confidential. You know, that is not for the public. So does anyone have any questions on executive session? Yes.
You mentioned that we could go into executive session for appointment to boards. Like with our current Board of Selectmen, one of the problems we have is when we appoint people to boards, you don't necessarily want to call in like if 10 people apply to a board, you don't want to, like, you can't discuss it. You can't be like, I can't say to the member from a different party, like, what do you think about so-and-so versus so-and-so for that board? I can't say that ahead of time. So how do you get that person in front of you or talk about who you might appoint, who you won't? So can you like the month before call an executive session on appointment to a board? And we have a few boards that are unanimous requirements. And you don't want to call, because you don't want to say, oh, Mr. Smith, we're gonna appoint you to this board. Maybe everyone will agree. And then have Mr. Smith come and get embarrassed because then we don't vote for him. I don't know. So
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to handle it would be, a couple, I guess what I would say is like, if you're gonna tell them ahead of time, it's like, well, we're considering your name for appointment among different candidates or something like that. And, how you do it is up to you. And I don't know, maybe there's a preliminary discussion among all, the people, and you figure out there's 3 people that we want to bring in for interviews. But, I saw there was another town where they had I think it was Ridgefield had a vacancy on their board of selectmen, and, they put in the minutes who they interviewed. It wasn't a mystery. They put in, there was an agenda and minutes, and it said, they had like 15-minute time slots for the different people. Every town does it a little bit differently. The unanimous thing is kind of interesting. That's obviously, something you guys have. Because the other thing that happens often is, my guess is that, if it's, you're going to fill it with the person of the same party, the members of that party, can, I mean, on a 3-member board, it's harder, but a larger board, they could caucus and decide who do we want, and then they could put the name forward, but yeah, I mean, consideration of, appointments to a board, could be an executive session. So, yes.
And would you need to alert every person that applied to that board?
So I think that, I think you would have to, if you're gonna go in as executive session personnel matters, because the thing about that, sometimes people ask like, how does this all work and why do we have to do all this? If you look at the statute about personnel matters, it says at the end, provided the person is notified. So if you're gonna cite that reason to go in, I think you have to notify them. I mean, I think the easiest way to do it probably would be, I assume that, you seek people's candidacies and they submit their things, and, there might be, again, like,
We can have 100 people.
Yeah, you can have 100 people that apply,
Really
and
down
then,
to 2.
yeah, you're down to 2. I think you tell those 2 people that.
Call the 100, or could we just call the 2?
I think the ones that you're actually gonna, if you're not gonna go through all 100 people at the meeting, then it's like, because sometimes people ask me like, well, how does this work with like, like applicants for like big jobs and stuff? I think normally what they do is kind of like, let's say you're gonna hire a police chief and you have 3 finalists. You call the 3 finalists and you say, hey, we're having a meeting Tuesday night. We're gonna talk about, the finalists. We'll let you know how it goes, kind of thing. Most of the time, people don't want to interview in public, I think most of the time. So it doesn't usually, that whole trigger with the thing, it doesn't, but the thing you need to be careful about is, if you're, again, if you're talking about people and they haven't been properly notified, because I've had situations where, it was a disciplinary matter involving a town employee, and, they didn't tell the person. And one of the board members knew the guy and basically threw the board under the bus and called the guy and said, hey, we were talking about you in this meeting and it wasn't on the agenda. And I don't think it was right. So, I think, again, most people are not going to opt for the public session. So I think you're probably safe to just tell them, let them know. Most people are probably going to think it's a courtesy heads up. I don't think they're going to, say, oh, okay, well now according to the statute, I want to do it in public. Yes.
So on the Board of Finance during budget season, we have the town attorney who's sitting right behind me. And he comes in during our risk management discussions on budgeting for risk management. And we talk about specific cases. These are cases that many of which are summary claims, but most of which are filed in Superior Court already. We don't list those cases like on our agenda.
We did when I became town attorney.
Oh, we did?
So what did you, so
Our agenda for the evening?
what did you used to say? Just like pending litigation?
I think it used to say risk management discussion.
Yeah.
So I made the change of listing the case.
Okay, yeah, I think that's smart, because the issue we had with the one where the first selectman got fined, what was happening was the town attorney was like kind of exasperated, because he was like, well, I'm like going through all there's 10 lawsuits filed. I'm going through all 10 lawsuits. And then, our executive director at the commission meeting was like, well, if you're listing put the 10 lawsuits on there. So I know it might seem like it's cumbersome, but, I guess the reasoning behind it, in the case we have it was the town of Suffield, they kind of like, I think, shed a little bit of light on some of why these things are important. Well, the person who filed the complaint was somebody who had a claim against the town. And they said, well, look, I want to know the meetings where they're talking about my claim, because what if they come out and they vote to settle it or something, right? I want to know that. I don't want to be sitting at home and somebody texts me and says, oh, now they're voting on, whatever to do with your case, or something. So, yeah, I think more is always better. The name of a case is not revealing your legal strategy, right? I mean, it just, it lets the public know, what's being discussed. So.
So if a case is discussed, goes further, someone brings up a case, we can't talk about it if it's not on the agenda.
So I mean, yeah, I would argue, yeah, if it's not, I mean, I think the thing the thing I would say is like, I think there's a difference between kind of, someone utters the word of a lawsuit, I think is a little bit different versus, if we have 5 cases and we talk about each one for 10 minutes, then I think all 5 cases should be on there. If you're talking about one case for 20 minutes and then somebody just says, oh yeah, this reminds me of that thing we had last, I think you use your judgment, but yeah, I mean, really generally under FOI, if it's not on the agenda, you really shouldn't be talking about it. And that's even why the thing I said about public comment, limiting it to items on the agenda, that's why a lot of boards do it, so that they don't, because what could happen potentially is if you get some eager resident who comes and talks about something who's not on the agenda during public comment, and the board starts getting into a dialogue with people, and and then somebody else says, oh, I didn't know they were going to be spending half an hour talking about sidewalks, I would have come to the meeting. So that sometimes that's why people will say that with the public comment. If something comes up during public comment and the board wants to start talking about it, you could always add it. If it was a regular meeting, you could add it to the agenda. Hey, there's 7 people that came out to talk about this thing. We didn't know about it. Let's put it on the agenda. Let's talk about what we can do. Yes.
One item that is not part of your 5 is we do this the same thing when we discuss like how much reserves we should put around for future salaries, is we talk about union negotiations and what predictions are for what we think union contracts will have for increases over the next year or couple of years. I don't see that listed as one of your.
So I think maybe where that, could come in is under if it's strategy or negotiations related to collective bargaining, it's technically not a
Yeah,
meeting.
that's what I was gonna ask. 'Cause
Yeah,
that was
it's like not a meeting. So,
meeting.
yes, so
Executive session.
yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of those things where, like, technically these things are not really executive session, but practically it's the same idea. So I don't think there's a
I
big,
just wanted to make sure that that's still.
yeah, like if you're talking strategy with collective bargaining, that like, you could do that outside of your meetings entirely if you wanted to. So you could meet, in the morning or something before work and talk about it with the staff or whoever.
When we used to have a press, which we don't have really anymore, they would ask, like, when we go to executive session, they'd want to know the reason. They don't have to do that now because they're all watching these movies. Later on.
Yeah, no, I mean, to get on my soapbox for a second, I mean, that one of the things that, drives me, I'm not even that old, but like the younger journalists I see, that's a lot of it, is they don't come anymore. And I'm like, well, and even when I was at the Hartford Courant, during COVID, I always, once we kind of receded a little bit, the younger reporters, that I worked with, I was like, you got to go out and meet people and go to meetings and stuff, because you pick up all kinds of stuff, that you're, I remember like, I would cover some Board of Ed meetings that would go for hours and hours. And like, that was the best time to get the superintendent, because, he felt bad that I sat there for 2.5 hours. So he would talk to me out in the hallway for 20 minutes about whatever I needed, where if I call his office, he's busy. So, any other, executive session questions? Okay. So again, we're not gonna, oh, sorry. Yes.
So if someone's taking minutes for the executive session, who's entitled to those minutes?
So I would say don't take minutes of executive session, because, I'm going to touch on a few things with public records, but one thing that is important to know is that, well, 2 things with that. One, I would argue, technically, I don't think the recording secretary should even be in the executive session, because they're not participating in the discussion, unless it was about the performance of the recording secretary and we need to fire them or something. And the other thing is, if you create a record that memorializes what happened in executive session, that is not automatically going to be exempt from FOI. So like if somebody, there are things that will be covered, like personal notes, there's an exemption for that. If the attorney is in the executive session and writes up some legal opinion, that's going to be privileged. But if somebody goes back to their computer and types up an email about what happened in executive session, now they've created a public record that might have to be disclosed. So I think I would say don't take minutes, and that's one of the reasons sometimes when the attorney's in there, they might pass something out and they might collect it, right? Because they don't want this stuff to be circulating because depending on what it is, again, some things are going to be exempt. If there's a proposed settlement agreement, that would probably be privileged. But if it's really just the discussion of what happened, there's no exemption for executive session. It's about meetings, it's not about records. Okay, so again, we're not going to go through all this stuff with public records, but a couple of things I think are really important. This is the definition of a public record. The main takeaway I want you all to have is, one, is how broad it is. Any data or information related to the conduct of the public's business. So it is if it deals with the business of the board that you serve on, it's a public record. The things that you receive, the materials, the packets, correspondence that you get from people serving on the board, emails that you send and receive, text messages that you send and receive. If you look at that definition too, nowhere on there do you see anything about the device the record exists on. And that is because under FOI, it doesn't matter. FOI is all about records. So what I mean is, everybody's got their cell phone. If you are texting with your personal phone, let's say other members of your board, and you're discussing board business, those text messages are public records. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody gets to look through your phone and look at all your texts with everybody, but it means that somebody could ask you for copies of those messages and you'd have to produce them unless there's an exemption. So if you're texting, with the town attorney, then those would be privileged. But if it's two selectmen and they're texting about, an item on the agenda for the meeting, those are public records. And if they're not of the same party, it could also be a meetings violation. It would be a discussion among a forum of a board. So people sometimes think, private device, it's not public records. There still can be public records. And the same thing goes with email. That's why I tell people, if you have a town email, that's available to you, I would just use that, because if an FOI request comes in, then they can help support you in doing the email searches and stuff. If you're using your Gmail or your Yahoo, you would have to go search your emails and find, what was responsive to the request. Any questions on that?
So if two members of the RTM out of 40 are texting each other during a meeting, that's part of the record?
Well, it's not part of the record of the meeting, but the text would be public records if they deal with public business. And the texting during a meeting thing, I know RTM is a lot different because it's much bigger, but more and more, I think, because meetings are now televised and, the online streaming and all that, I've had a lot of people ask me recently about the issue of, I saw these two members of a board texting during the meeting, I want to FOI their text messages. And the answer is they could, right? If the messages are pertaining to the public's business. Now, if you're, answering a text from your spouse and you're saying, I'm going to be late, I'm going to pick up dinner on the way home, those are not public records, obviously. Or if you're, if you're talking, you're friendly with members on the board and you're texting back and forth about the Yankees or the Red Sox or something, those are not public records. But if you're talking about, decisions about the board is making, or the people who are addressing the board, if you're saying, oh my God, this guy is going on and on and on, I can't, what is he thinking? Those are things that, could be asked for. And, Tom Hennick, who had this job for a long time before me, got a little thing he had on his desk, and he actually left it for me. He got it from a town clerk, and it said, when in doubt, don't hit send. And I think that is very important to keep in mind, sometimes, because in the heat of the moment, it's like that thing they say where you're supposed to write a letter and then put it in your desk drawer and then look at it in 2 days and still, see if you still want to send it. That's the kind of stuff where, it can just be embarrassing. And sometimes it's just somebody in the heat of the moment. I mean, there was a story I read recently. There was somebody who worked, it's a couple of years ago, but the story just came out. Somebody who worked in the Attorney General's office called the state attorney general called somebody an asshole, somebody who was suing the state, said, I can't get rid of this asshole soon enough. I mean, in an email, don't put it in an email. Because the other thing is, there's people who will ask for any emails that mention their name. And so if you say, John Smith is blah, 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 that's how people find these things sometimes, and it can be really embarrassing. So, and the basic premise of FOI, how it operates is, if it's a record dealing with the public's business, then it needs to be made available to the public, except as otherwise provided by federal law or state statute. So basically, I'm going to skip this stuff, but this is about exemptions and exceptions. So There are state and federal laws that make certain things confidential. You know, we don't have time to go through all of them, but this is just to give you an idea of some of the exemptions that are within the FOI Act, you know, attorney-client privilege, preliminary drafts, certain personnel or medical files, records related to collective bargaining strategy or negotiation. The RFP one, I think, is kind of important if that ever comes up before your board. Prior to a contract being awarded, you don't have to turn over the bid documents. Once the contract is awarded, then the bid documents become public. That also allows you to go into executive session, you know, with prospective bidders to discuss those things. So, you know, once the contract is signed, then, you know, then the stuff becomes public and the discussions would have to be public, and so on. But I'm going to end on this. Does anyone have any other questions about records or meetings or anything? I know we covered a lot of material. Really what I would say is, you know, if you have a question, don't be afraid to ask your town attorney. You can ask the commission. You know, I really try to be very responsive to people because I understand, you know, when you're emailing or calling me, usually somebody's asking you something, you know, you have questions about an agenda that's got to get filed that day. So I really do try to be responsive. And, you know, again, I'm happy to do any other future trainings or, you know, that type of stuff. If people are interested, you know, on other boards or anything like that. Does anyone have any last questions?
So for the RFP, so if a building committee is interviewing potential people that submitted a bid, could that be done in executive session?
Yeah, prior to awarding a contract, yes. Yeah, you could do that. Because the idea there is that, you know, it's like the attorney-client memo. The records, the responses that you've received are exempt. So if you want to discuss the responses, you know, with the people who submitted them, you could do that in executive session.
And then if they needed to vote on who would be awarded the contract, that should be done in public.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So you could, you know, you could have all the bids come in, you could have 3 that you really like, you could interview the 3 bidders, and then you take a public vote to award the contract.
What happens if some members of a caucus are messaging amongst each other, but it's not the full caucus? Is that open to FOIA? So like on a RTM, there's 40 members. Let's say 5 of the, I don't know, 37.
Yeah, that they're, yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think the key thing is, you know, regardless of, this kind of goes with the executive session thing, regardless of it's a caucus, executive session, it's all about, is the content of those messages in some way related to the public's business. Like the only thing I've really, because I've kind of scratched my head with this, some people have asked me about it, like the only thing I think you could argue where it's like, you know, wouldn't be a public, it's really would be weird because you'd have to say it's not a public record, would be like if it was something that was like entirely political, nothing to do with public's business. And by that, I mean, like if you're texting back and forth about where to put lawn signs, like something like that, you know, I think you could argue like that has nothing to do with the public's business, that's a political matter, you know, or something like that. But anything else, I mean, you know, even if it's a caucus, if you're conducting your caucus over text message or email, it's a legal caucus, but the records are going to exist. And if somebody knew that that was what you did, you know, that's how this stuff comes to light sometimes. People know, oh, that guy's a big texter. That's how he communicates. So they know, and then they ask for text messages. And then, you know, sometimes they turn up text messages and that's where people file meetings complaints because they get a text message back that shows that, you know, people were communicating outside of meetings or something.
So a text message among caucus members, if it's the whole caucus on the text message is FOIA-able? So like we're both on the Board of Selectmen. If I sent her a text
If
message,
it's pertaining to the public's business, those are public
those are
records.
public,
Yes,
even
so
though we're a
the
caucus.
caucus is privileged in terms of it's not a meeting, so it doesn't have to be conducted in public. But if it's memorialized somehow, then, you know, so there would need to be some exemption to cover those. I mean, if you're talking about, you know, the strategy with a lawsuit, then those texts are going to be privileged. Or if you guys are texting with the town attorney and you guys are in a chain together and you're talking legal things, you know, those would be privileged. But if it's just like, you know, what do you think of this candidate or something for the vacancy?
Wait, we can't meet with the town attorney though.
Just the two of them.
Because I
Oh,
can.
sorry, yeah, no, you can't, yeah.
Yeah, okay, wait, I was like, I
That's a bad
can't
example.
be doing that, period, right? Yeah, we're like, I was like, oh.
If you were discussing a memo he sent you or something like that, yeah,
Yeah,
if you were
okay.
texting it, yeah, if you're texting about, you know, legal strategy or legal advice, yeah, not to include it. Good, so.
My telephone calls are great.
I totally neglected, we have questions on the computer, I see, so, I'll let those, Do I have to unmute those people or can they just come
She'll
up?
unmute them if you say their name.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I totally forgot. Craig, can we do Craig? Sorry about the computer people.
Is that Craig Curley?
Craig Curley. It's like we just got two.
We have to take attendance for this meeting of Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance members. We have three, I don't know.
Cruise on. I don't know how
Who
to.
else is? Oh, Prue's online, so she'll get online.
Okay, hi, it's Craig Curley. Had a tough time coming off on mute there. Thank you. I just had a quick follow-up question on the caucus guidance. You used an example of how a member of the Board of Selectmen could not join a caucus for the Board of Finance, for example. But I believe we are set up as ex officio members of each other's boards. Does that provide the leeway to allow us?
Yeah, you could do it if that's the case. And I know some towns, the first selectman is ex officio on all town boards.
Board of
Right.
Selectmen is ex officio. on
Yeah,
it.
so yeah, ex officio, then you could participate.
Great. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, Board of Finance,
So you-
but the Board of Finance is not for the Board of Selectmen, so we're not ex officio to the Board of Selectmen. So therefore, we can't attend your meetings or vote or like participate in them.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, ex officio, they count as a member.
Yeah. But the Board of Finance is for the RTM, so I can attend and talk.
Yeah, I've lived in Connecticut my whole life and RTMs are still a mystery to me. You know, it's funny because like I grew up in a small town and we had a Board of Selectmen, but you know, we had town meetings. So it's like, that's what I'm familiar with. So, and then we have Prue has a question, it looks like too.
Hi, thank you. Prue O'Brien. I am a recording secretary, but I also work in purchasing. And I'm a little confused about the responses to bid solicitations and RFPs. Did you say that they had to be voted on publicly?
If you're going to award a contract, you have to take a public vote. So, like if a board is considering multiple, you know, options and the board is going to vote on who to hire, then they need to take a public vote.
Okay, only if it's for the board. All right, I'm sorry, I was a little confused.
Yeah. If
about
there's
that.
things that you guys do in your office or decisions you make, yeah, that doesn't matter. But it's about if the board is deciding among vendors
Okay,
for
yes.
something, they would have to vote.
All right, thank you.
I don't think we have any other questions online. Oh wait, I see one more. Emma has her hand up.
Oh, sorry. I'm like technologically challenged. Thank you for your presentation. My question is regarding different communication platforms and so how FOIA applies to like something like Signal.
So honestly, the only thing I know of Signal is the whole thing with our federal government.
No, yeah, exactly.
But it's like a text messaging platform type of thing.
Yes, and it's
Okay,
meant to be like it disappears after, similar to WhatsApp from what I've
okay.
understood.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same rules would apply now. We didn't talk about it. Records retention is a whole different set of statutes and there are records retention statutes and, you know, including for public officials. So I would be wary of using a platform where the stuff deletes automatically because, you know, that might run afoul of the records retention laws. But, you know, under FOI, I think somebody could ask for, you know, text messages, WhatsApp, Signal, Facebook, you know, it's again, it's not the devices or the platform, it's the content or the messages related in some way to the public's business. You know, the one I've heard of, you know, like if you use, you know, sometimes reporters, I think, use Signal and because they're like, contact me securely at Signal. If you had an elected official who said, you know, anonymously, you can contact me via this platform, you know, those messages they receive would still be public records. It's not how it's received, it's the content of it.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, well, I really appreciate you guys, you know, coming out, taking some time on a Monday night. I think you're doing a lot of other things. But please don't, you know, don't be a stranger if I can help you, or talk to Phil. He's great. He knows stuff. So Hopefully you're not having to worry about FOI. And, again, if you have questions or scenarios you want to run by me, I'm happy to do that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We should just
I'm
adjourn.
good at drawing them. All in favor? Aye.